Now, a very warm welcome to everyone for our Sydney Atheists finale event, The Difference Between Knowledge, Belief and Expectation. This evening's speaker is Tibor Molnar. He's an Honorary Associate of the Department of Philosophy, University of Sydney, and teaches philosophy for science. It gives us great pleasure in introducing Tibor.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thanks, Steve, and welcome, everyone. Yes, tonight's talk is knowledge, belief, and expectation. Steve and I chose this topic because it really lies at the heart of every disagreement and every debate and every argument you've ever had. It all hinges on what you think you know and why you think you know it and why your beliefs aren't the same as somebody else's beliefs. And it's a rather complicated question, ultimately. It's something which is not well understood, and it's a source of much debate. And so it's maybe we can try and straighten it out a little bit today. Unsurprisingly, I'm going to talk about knowledge, belief, and expectation. If time permits, I'll also talk to you about truth and justification, because they're also issues that feed into the way we believe things and the way we get to know things, and then I'll try and sum it all up at the end. Let's start with knowledge, shall we? Okay. Philosophers have been pondering the nature of knowledge for millennia. They really have. It's been going on for over 2,500 years, and, well, anybody who's had a go at it. That's just some of the bigger names. I'm sure you know most of them. And here tonight, I'm going to be adding my name to that list. You have to wonder why I do that. Why would anybody sign up for that? But anyway, that's how it's going to be. Okay, needless to say, all those philosophers didn't agree with each other. And as A.J. Ayer observed, the reason is that knowledge means many different things. Here are just a few of the definitions: to be familiar with, to have experience of, to be able to recognize, to remember, to have mastery, to be aware. They're all related. They're all very close to each other, but they're not quite the same thing. The English dictionary, the Concise Oxford, has at least 8 different definitions for the verb to know. And here they are. I won't list them. These definitions leave many questions unanswered, partly because they are slightly different, and the differences, the nuances of meaning have exercised the minds of philosophers for ages. Let me quickly go through them. Questions we want to know are, what do claims of knowledge entail and what do they have in common? What constitutes the satisfactory justification of a claim for knowledge? If you want to claim you know something, what justification do you really need to have to make that a worthwhile, to make it a valid claim? What's the difference between knowing, believing and thinking and merely remembering? That's something else we'll have to pick apart. Is knowing a mental act or is it a state of mind? Is it possible to believe something which is true and not know it? Not as in not know that you know it, but is it possible that you believe something, it happens to be true, but it isn't knowledge? Or is that automatically knowledge? That's something we have to pick apart. Is it possible to know something and be wrong? Is there such a thing as false knowledge? What about the ancient times when people thought the earth was flat? Some people, not everybody. There's quite a few Greeks who actually thought it was round. But those people who thought it was flat, they would claim to know that it was flat. They had evidence. They weren't falling off. They weren't rolling off the sides. They weren't being flung off like a merry-go-round. They didn't feel that centrifugal acceleration. So it had to be flat and stationary. It's the only way it could work. Now, they knew that. Did they? Did they actually know incorrectly? Or did they just not know? That's another question we have to tease apart. Okay, and of course, is there anything thinkable that's beyond the reach of human knowledge? A good question. Before I answer those questions, let me say a little bit about how we go about defining words. We're trying to define what knowledge is here. There's 2 ways of going about it. One way is to pick up all these different definitions of knowledge and try and work out which one's the right one. Okay? The other way, and I prefer the second way, is forget that. Work out what it is you want to say. Work out what you mean, and then assign the word to it. And then you won't have a semantic argument at the end of it. You won't be arguing about the meaning of the word. You all agree on what you want to say. All you have to do is decide what word you want to use to describe it. So that's what I want to do. I'm not going to go through all these different definitions that I offered here and say, well, that one's wrong, and this one's right, and that one's wrong. That's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to find out exactly what it is we want to say, what it is that we want to call knowledge, and then call that knowledge, assign the word to it. So, what is knowledge? We all know, you're all familiar with this, Plato has his definition, justified true belief. This is the bread and butter of philosophical definitions of knowledge. And superficially at least, it makes sense, because we have at least to believe something before we can say that we can know it. If you don't even believe it, then how can you possibly know it? It has to be true, because otherwise it wouldn't really be knowledge, would it? And it has to be justified, otherwise you wouldn't be able to distinguish it from just a lucky guess. So to be knowledge, it has to be a justified true belief. That's Plato's story. Okay? Now, so it looks a bit like this. You've got a world of propositions, which are just statements of any sort, and some of them happen to be true and some of them don't. That's fine. You can have false statements. That's perfectly acceptable. Some of them you happen to believe. Some of them you think you hold them as a view. And where those two cross, where they intersect, if you have some justification for them, then you might claim that they are knowledge. But characterizing knowledge in this way is problematic. There are all sorts of things wrong with this if you stop and think about it and dig a little deeper. So, first of all, it's tautological. If something is properly justified, how could it not be true? Surely, if it's not true, then you've failed in your justification somewhere. There's something wrong with your justification. So once it's justified, it must be true. I'm not talking about justification as in being entitled to hold the view. I mean justification as in whatever proof or evidence you need to justify your claim. Secondly, it's self-referential. How might we establish that something is true without justifying it? What other method is there? Surely justification is exactly what it takes in order for something to be true. Third, it's circular. Don't you have to know that a belief is justified or know that the belief is true before you can know what you know? You have to have prior knowledge in order to have knowledge. There's something circular about this definition. There's a bootstrap problem here. It's also inadequate because it doesn't allow you to recognize knowledge. You don't know it when you see it. It doesn't tell you how to find it or how to recognize it or identify it. So there's a number of different problems, even semantic problems, even just problems with the definitions of what it means to be a justified true belief. There's got to be lots of things wrong with it. Philosophers know this, and they've done all sorts of work with get-here examples and who knows what. They've been agonizing over trying to fix up Plato's definition to get it right. They've been struggling with this for 2,500 years. In fact, in the same dialogue, in Plato's Socratic dialogue, the Theaetetus, Plato himself recognizes that justified true belief is the wrong answer. Now, I'm amazed at how often and how widely that is forgotten. Everybody remembers that Plato said it was justified true belief. Nobody remembers that justified true belief was something that Plato thought was the wrong answer. Okay? What he did say is that knowledge is neither sensation nor true opinion nor yet definition and explanation. He actually said, look, it can't be all those things. That's wrong. And he says it in the very next paragraph after he said it was justified true belief. But people have forgotten that. Sadly, he hasn't offered us any alternative. He didn't come up with a better plan. He left that hanging in the air. He hasn't got any good ideas. And, of course, philosophers have been agonising over coming up with a better definition ever since. And, well, I'm going to have another go today. Bit of audience participation here. Let's see if we can work out what we mean when we want to say what knowledge is. Okay, let's suppose, we'll do a little thought experiment. Einstein called these Gedanken experiments. A little thought experiment. Suppose we go up to young Adam over there and we ask him for Jack's phone number and he says, oh yeah, I know what that is, it's 9368, and he tells you the number. Here's our first question. Does he know Jack's phone number? Who thinks yes? Show of hands, please. Everybody play along. Okay. Anyone thinks he doesn't know? Would anyone Okay, why not? Can I invite you to tell me why not? Please.
Well,
Speak up.
Adam's phone number might have changed in the few instances since he last saw him.
Oh, okay, all right, okay, true. Let's assume the number is correct. Okay, does that satisfy you?
Yeah.
All right, so the number is right. Okay, Sue.
I'd say that it's not knowing, it's remembering.
Good point. Yes, it is. He remembers. So one of the questions we have to now work out is whether remembering something is the same as knowing something. That's a question we will cover. I've got that one. Okay, any other opinions? No? Okay, but basically we think that if the number's right, then, yeah, okay, he sounds like he knows. All right, next question. Does he believe that he knows? If you asked Adam, do you believe that you know Jack's phone number, would he say yes or no? Who thinks yes? Okay, who thinks no? There's no exceptions? Nobody? No no's this time? Okay, all right. Is his belief justified? Is he justified in saying that he believes that he knows Jack's phone number? And is his belief true? Well, if the number's right, then yes, he is. So this is in close agreement so far with Plato's definition. This is justified true belief. In fact, Adam holds not one, but two justified true beliefs. He believes that Jack's phone number is 9368 whatever, and that's his knowledge. That's his justified true belief about Jack's phone number. Okay? Now, he also believes that he knows Jack's phone number. That's meta-knowledge. That's a belief about his other belief that he knows Jack's phone number. Okay? Now that distinction, a distinction between beliefs and beliefs about beliefs, that's not covered in Plato's definition of justified true belief. So we'll have to also separate out the difference between those two. Okay. So far, Plato's definition seems to work just fine, more or less. So now let's ask, where is Adam's knowledge? Well, it's got to be in here somewhere. And yet when we look, we find only neurons. What you find is about 1.3 kilograms of something that has a consistency of panna cotta or something. It's sort of a jello-like, it's mush. There's nothing there that looks like knowledge. And there's even nothing there that looks like it ought to know anything. There's not even knowing stuff there. None of that stuff is the kind of stuff that would know. So where is it? That's another problem we have to solve. We have to work out when we say somebody knows something or something knows something, where is it? What is it? Can we identify what that is? All right, another thought experiment. Here we go. Let's ask Bob over here whether he knows Jack's phone number. And he says, yeah, of course I do. I've got it here in my phone. And he goes tap, 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 and he tells you the number. Okay, does Bob know Jack's phone number? Who would say yes? Maybe. One or two. Okay, why? Tell me why. How is it that he knows?
Presumably he's rung that number before and knows that it's Bob.
Okay, but he doesn't remember the number. He had to look it up on his phone. So does he know it? Or what he knows is he knows that it's in his phone?
Correct.
He knows that.
It's in the phone.
Now, is that the same? Is that good enough for claiming that he knows Jack's phone number? Yes or no? 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 No's got the vote? All right, I think the no's have it. Okay, does he believe that he knows? If you asked him and said, hey, Bob, do you believe that you know Jack's phone number? Would he say yes or no? Who thinks he'd say yes? Okay, and the rest of you would say no, I suppose. Okay, all right. Now, is there anyone in the room who said yes to the second question but no to the first one? Because I want you to explain that. There's a disagreement there. I want to know if there is a fact of the matter. Is there a right answer? Does he or doesn't he? And is it just a question of whom you ask? You ask him whether he thinks he knows his phone number, he'll say yes. But if I ask you, you'll say no. But obviously now things are not quite so simple, right? Because Bob may or may not believe that he knows the number. He might say, oh yeah, well I don't remember it, so I don't know it. Or, yes, I've got it on my phone here, and it's my phone, so I have privileged access to this number, and you don't, so therefore I know something you don't, so I've got knowledge that you don't have, so I know Jack's phone number. We don't know that. It's indeterminate. But he does believe, or he knows that Jack's number is recorded in his phone. He knows that. And he's also demonstrated he could recall the phone number and deliver it, produce it when requested. So the question is, does that constitute knowing Jack's phone number? It's not entirely clear. Okay, and where's Bob's knowledge? Well, this time it has to be in here somewhere, I suppose. But when you look inside, well, doesn't look like knowledge. Again, we don't see anything that looks like knowledge, and we don't even see anything that looks like it ought to know anything. I mean, what can a silicon chip tell you about knowing stuff? There's still no grasp on what knowledge is. We still don't have that. Okay, another experiment. Something different this time. Let's ask Eddie over here, what is 75 times $68? And he's pretty good at mental arithmetic, and he goes, think, and he says, yes, it's $5,100. Now, does Eddie know what the 75 by $68 is? Who thinks yes? Anybody? Who thinks no, he doesn't know? Okay, who didn't put their hand up? Let's try that again. Who thinks yes, Eddie does know what 75 times $68 is? He knows the process, but he doesn't know the answer. That's right. My next question was going to be, did he know the answer before he worked it out? Did he know the value of 75 by $68, or does he just know how to do maths? Okay? Now, being able to do the maths, is that good enough for knowing what 75 by $68 is? Maybe, maybe not. It's not clear. Again, it's not entirely clear. So exactly what does he know? Well, he knows how to do mental arithmetic. He knows how to work it out. But then, here's a question. What's the difference between this example, and Bob knowing that he can look up the telephone number in the phone? It's the same, isn't it? And yet, some of us were inclined to say, yeah, well, he knows the number because he knows he can look it up. But here you're not prepared to say that he knows the number or knows the answer because he can work it out. So there's still a subtle issue here which is not entirely clear. Does he believe he knows? Well, if you asked him, there'd be a 2-second delay while he worked out the answer, but he'd say yes, wouldn't he? He'd think he knows, even though you think he doesn't. So again, the question is there a fact of the matter? Does he or doesn't he know? Or is it just a matter of opinion? It just depends on whom you ask. It's not entirely clear. And is he justified in his belief? Well, he'll tell you it's $5,100. He knows the answer. All right, and then we'll ask George over here, and he's just got a calculator out and says, yeah, tap, 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 it's $5,100. Does he know? Everyone would say no to that, right? Because you don't even have evidence that he knows how to do the maths. He just knows how to operate a calculator. But here's a scenario. This is a thought experiment after all. Let's suppose that George is actually an exceptionally good mathematician. It's just that he's so distracted with some other problem. He's got something else on his mind. And he says, oh, blah, blah, I haven't got time to think about it. Picks up a calculator, works it out, and tells you, well, in actual fact, if he decided to spend 3 seconds, he could have thought about it, but then he would have lost his train of thought about whatever else he was working on. So maybe he knows more than you think. How would you tell?
Only if you believe it.
Only if you believe it, but you'd never know, right? So the question now is it possible for us to decide whether somebody knows something, or are they the only ones who can decide for themselves that they know? Because we can only go by the evidence we see. We don't know what goes on inside their heads. So there's another issue that, again, Plato's definition doesn't cater for. It doesn't allow you to differentiate between what a person themselves thinks they know and what everybody else thinks they know. And they're not always the same answer. Okay, so does George know? Does he believe it? Is he justified? All the same questions. All right, that's enough scenarios. We've had enough of this. It seems that the closer we look, though, the less we find anything that even looks like knowledge or even looks like it knows. We don't know any of this. But I don't think we should be too surprised at this because we really are looking for the wrong thing. Knowledge isn't a thing. We're not going to find an object out there in the world which is called knowledge. And it isn't anywhere. It's not located in a particular place, not even in someone's head. It's not that kind of thing. Knowledge is actually what we call in philosophy an attribution. An attribution isn't a property of something. It's not something that something has. It's not something that something is. It's something that we say about it. And it says something about us that we say it. It doesn't say anything about what properties it has and what it does. What we do when we say something knows is we're declaring that some autonomous system, if it weren't autonomous, then something else would be telling it what to do, so it doesn't have to know. But some autonomous system has whatever it takes, and we may not know what that is, but it has whatever it takes in order to perform the requisite action, to tell you a phone number, to multiply numbers, whatever it is you want them to do, whatever it is they do. If they're able to do it, and they're able to do it autonomously, then somehow mysteriously we say they know. So what we do is we attribute an ability to do something to an autonomous system. That's what we mean, I think, when we talk about knowledge. And that's something that was common to all the scenarios that I offered here. Anybody disagree with that? Anyone got a reason to disagree? Okay, then. Now, so that means that when we are satisfied that the autonomous system acts correctly, then we say it knows. And vice versa. If we're not satisfied that it did it correctly, if we don't have confidence in what it's doing, then we'll say it doesn't know. If it asks it to ride a bicycle and it doesn't, well, then we just say, look, it hasn't demonstrated the knowledge, so therefore it doesn't know. We just draw our own conclusions. We attribute the knowledge to it, whether it has it or not. We do this blindly. We just do it because we think it knows. It doesn't matter how it does it. I mean, if you ask somebody, do they know how to reverse park a road train, even a truck driver will say, no, I don't know how I do it, I just do it. He won't be able to give you an equation or give you a series of formulas that says, this is how you do it, you turn the wheel like this and like that. He just does it by feel. You do it by learning, you do it by repetition, right? But you acquire the skill not by sitting down and learning it out of a textbook. You can't learn to reverse park a road train by reading a manual. Okay, we make this attribution blindly. We do it with scant regard for what, if anything, the system has or what the system knows or how it does it. We may even have no idea whatsoever about what it takes to perform the action. And we'll still say it knows because it knows something you don't. And we say the system knows something, that it possesses something called knowledge. While actual worldly affairs, facts, are objectively true, knowing the fact is utterly subjective. The facts are as they are, regardless of whether you know them or not. And the facts are, the knowledge is only available to those who believe whatever information is to be justified and true. If you think it's right, well then you will claim to know it. To those who don't believe it, it's just not knowledge. If you don't believe it, then whatever is being claimed is just wrong and it's not knowledge. So for us to recognize something as knowledge, we have first to justify it to ourselves, to satisfy ourselves that it's correct, and only then do we admit it as knowledge. Now, of course, if you don't admit it to yourself, but somebody else admits it to themselves, then they're going to claim to know something that you don't. And the difference is that one of you have felt that it was justified and the other one didn't. It's the truth or the correctness of an autonomous system's actions that motivates and justifies, perhaps retrospectively after we've seen them do it, that justifies our belief that it knows. So when we attribute knowledge to some system, it is we who hold the justified true belief about their knowledge. It's not they who have justified true belief in their knowledge, it's we who have it. We're the ones who claim that they know. Okay? So Plato got it almost right. He just missed the target. He just pointed the justified true belief at the wrong person. Okay, we may also think of knowledge as a meta-belief, as a belief about beliefs. As a justified true belief that some person or system, perhaps even ourselves, is in the right mental state, holds a necessary true belief to perform a prescribed action correctly. So what are these knowing systems? What are these autonomous systems? Well, they may be individuals, like Adam, who knows Jack's phone number, or they may be groups of people, like the SES, who knows what to do in an emergency, or the army, or the police force or whoever, there are groups of people who know what to do, or we say they know what to do. They may even be inanimate. Facebook knows my birthday, right? Self-driving cars know how to avoid accidents. So, we even inanimate objects, we will attribute knowledge to them if they are able to perform a particular task. So we may define knowing, first of all, as being in a state. Just being in a state that facilitates the correct and reliable performance of some action, regardless of how it's done. And it doesn't have to be the same state. It has to be a state that facilitates the performance of that action. You and I could be in different states, each of which facilitates our acting the same way. It doesn't mean we have to be doing exactly the same thing. You don't need to have exactly the same knowledge to do something. The way you instantiate something in your brain could be entirely different to the way I do it in my brain, and yet we both multiply numbers together and come up with the right answers. And accordingly then, we may define knowledge as the following. They are the disembodied qualities of the state of knowing. What we do is we say, the state of knowing is what enables him to do that. Let's now imagine what is required for that state to be the case, and let's remove that state from the system that has the state. Let's disembody it and call that knowledge. Okay? It's a freaky mental little game that we play. But technically speaking, this reification, this declaring as real, declaring there is this thing called these disembodied qualities, that declaration is what Gilbert Ryle called a category mistake. Gilbert Ryle was another Oxford Don in the early to mid-20th century. He wrote a book called The Concept of Mind, which I can highly recommend. And in there he describes a category mistake as regarding the quality of something as if it were a thing in itself. And there's plenty of examples of that in philosophy and elsewhere. We do it all the time. There are lots of things that we call things that are not. Some examples, redness or goodness, or even the word triangle. Has anyone ever seen a triangle? Who thinks I've seen a triangle? Lots of you. Okay. Guess what? What you saw was a triangular object. You've never seen a triangle that wasn't an object that was triangular. You might have seen things in triangular alignment, in triangular attitude. You might see things that are triangular in different ways. The adjective triangular is an attributable property of things in the world. But a triangle is not a thing in the world. There is no such thing as a triangle which is not a property of something that is a triangle. Even the musical instrument, a triangle, is called that because it's triangular. Okay? So there's a really interesting example of a case where we all do. We all talk about triangles if they existed, but they don't. Okay, so knowledge is like that. Knowledge is not a possession. It's not something has. It's not a property. It's not something is. It's not an entity. It's not a thing in its own right. It's just the reification of the imagined qualities of what we think it takes for something to do something. It's this disembodied qualities that we call knowledge. So knowledge is no more real than that. So instead of asking what knowledge is, we should be asking different questions. I think the whole project of trying to identify and describe what knowledge is a mistake. The questions to ask are these. What properties or qualities must a system have to be capable of attaining disposition or knowing states? In order to behave as if it knew, what kinds of properties would it have to be able to be like that? And how does the system get into those states? In other words, how does it learn? Well, I have a model for you. Looks like this. It's a bit complicated, so I'll explain to you how it works. I'll go through it bit by bit. There's memory. First of all, you have to have memory. Without memory, you can't do anything. You can't even add two numbers together, because by the time I told you the second one, you will have forgotten the first. So you can do absolutely nothing without memory. All knowing systems have to be memory-based. And this is just static memory. You record something, it's like a tape recorder. You record something and it remembers it. Okay? You can make it a bit more complicated. You can have dynamic memory. This is memory which is somehow adaptive. What it remembers the second time depends a little bit on what it had to remember the first time. So what it does is it habituates, it forms habits, it aligns itself to what it's been doing, it gets used to doing things in certain ways, and therefore it remembers certain things better than other things, and it starts to develop biases or preferences. It's just memory, but it is physically built in such a way that it is adaptive, and it adapts to what it remembers as it goes. Now, once you've got memory like that, you have to give it some inputs and some outputs. So let's do that. I've got some input coming up here. Here is the detection device. They could be eyes or ears or nose, and that will feed information about an external worldly event into memory. If you do a little bit of data analysis along the way, you can produce something which is a bit more sophisticated, some sense data, and feed that into memory. And of course, it has to be able to do something, so you want the memory to be able to produce some action, you want it to feed into some muscles or some motor or engine or something, and you get it to perform an action which produces an external worldly event. This is a simple stimulus response mechanism. The E. coli bacterium, it's a little single-cell bacterium, is exactly something like this. It gets by, it senses its environment, it acts on it, and doesn't do much else. It's got no idea what's going on. Okay, now let's make it a bit more complicated still. Let's do some input and output processing. We'll allow it to do some apprehension here, work out what it is sensing, get it to know a little bit about what's going on, and we get it to do some deliberation over here and think about what kind of action it's going to perform. It's now going to be slightly smarter. This is a non-conscious thinking system. Most artificial intelligence machines today are somewhere around this standard. Okay? Now, let's make it a bit harder. Let's now do something which is probably the most remarkable step that nature has ever taken. We'll introduce feedback. Okay? What we'll do is we'll allow the memory to produce experiences here, and we'll feed them back into memory, and we'll allow memory to sense its own contents. So now memory can think about what it thinks. And that sets up several feedback loops around here. Now the system is self-aware. It now knows what it's thinking. It doesn't just think about the world, it now thinks about itself in the world. So self-awareness hinges critically on that level of feedback. Let's go one step further. Let's do some thinking. Let's allow the system to come down here and to put things into context, to identify what things are, to compare things one thing with another, put things in order, to interpret things. We'll give it some smarts. We'll give it some thinking powers. Dogs and cats and higher mammals and humans up to the age of about 2 do this. Okay? This diagram is vastly oversimplified. It really is. If you look over here, that area at the top is all the input stuff. It's detection, it's sense data, it's just picking up input from the world. In fact, that is really like this. This is what is really going on in there. And it takes some tens of billions of neurons to make that happen. A very large percentage, maybe up to half your brain, is used just in processing vision. It's very, very difficult to do. So imagine how complicated the whole thing is when it's just that part there which is that complicated. So my model here is a vastly oversimplified, stylistic, schematic kind of diagram. Okay, knowing systems are vastly complex. They're vastly complex assemblies of data recorders, input machines, information storage devices, various kinds of memory. You've got at least 3 or 4 different types of memory in your brain. Signal processors, that's what neurons are. Amplifiers, inference engines, We can build electronic equivalents of all of these, which is why we're now getting pretty good at building artificial intelligence machines. But nature has managed to get these and wrap them up in neat little packages that look just like this. That's what this is. This is a knowing system. And in its head, it's got 100 billion vastly interconnected neurons with about 7,000 synapses each. That means that each neuron is connected actively to 7,000 of its neighbours. It's a telephone exchange like you've never seen in your life. It's the most tangled net nature has ever been able to invent. That means there's up to about a quadrillion synapses in all. That's a number with, 15 zeros? About 10% of those neurons fire maybe once or twice a second. Some of them fire very rarely. They're there for specific purposes, and they don't do much. They just sit there for when they're called upon. But that means that there's approximately 10 to the 14 bits per second going around inside your head. That's 1,000 laptop computers. That's a network of 1,000 laptop computers where, you need more than that because you need 7,000 to have everything connected to everything. You can't have the connectivity, but in terms of brute computing power, if you have 1,000 64-bit i7 processor, CPU, kind of expensive laptops, you go to Harvey Norman and buy sort of $1,500 laptops and get 1,000 of them, you've got about as much computing power as what goes on inside your head in brute computing power. But there's other things that go on. You rewire about 1.5 million synapses of those. So you disconnect and reconnect the connections between the neurons about 1.5 million times per second. That's what thinking is. And you use around 20 watts of energy to do it. You could almost run a light globe on it. And that's about 25% of all the energy your body produces. So you're using, right now, sitting there quietly as you are, you're using a quarter of all the energy your body is producing just to run the brain. It's a very expensive device to run, but it's very good. And all of that is called thinking. So I guess the next thing we have to do is work out what thinking is. So how might we characterize thinking? What's thinking? Well, Rodin had an idea. Didn't know he was a philosopher, did you? Okay, thinking is a kind of systematic computation. It's a symbolic representation. You have to have some kind of symbols in your head that you manipulate that represent the things you're thinking about. You have to make them meaningful, so you have to ascribe meaning to them. And you have to do this intentionally. You have to be able to control this process. And then you need some kind of rule-governed process whereby you manipulate these symbols and put them together and come up with answers. So there's some sort of calculation that you have to perform. This can be done by any suitable computer, so long as it's got the right ingredients. It's got to have memory, it has to have registers, accumulators, data integrators, difference engines, whatever else you need. And it also needs to have these weighted feedback-driven adaptive networks I won't go into, but that's exactly what computers don't have today. Your brain has them, but computers don't. That's that massively interconnected wiring. When we start building that into computers, they will become truly intelligent. That's all that's missing. That's the only reason why our artificial intelligent computers are not yet all that intelligent. They will be. It won't be long before we do that. We're working on that already. And of course, thinking happens in all these different places. That's IBM's Blue Gene computer called Sequoia. In 2012, it was the fastest computer in the world, and it ran at something like 10 to the power 16 computations per second. That's 16 zeros, computations per second. It was 1 million times more powerful than the computer that defeated Boris Kasparov at chess. So Boris Kasparov in 1997, he wasn't up against something like this. Even this little thing down here, which is the Micro Wolf in 2007, even that is twice as powerful as the computer that defeated Boris Kasparov. Okay? And of course, sometimes thinking happens in here. Those things run that one on the left, the Micro Wolf runs at about 26 gigaflops, for those people who know what that is. That's billions of floating point operations per second. This thing probably runs at less than 1 gigaflop. It runs in the order of teraflops. Okay, so we're pretty slow. But what we do in our brains, which is something computers don't do, is we have massively parallel computing, as opposed to one step at a time, linear programming that computers do. Of course, all that thinking happens down here. This is the region down here where all that thinking happens. That's where it fits into this model. So if you've got the right stuff down here, then you can do thinking. And you need that to be a knowing system. Remember, this is what a knowing system is. And thinking is one component of that. In fact, we can go around the loop. There's the detection stuff up the top. We have experiences. We then think about them. We end up with knowledge. We act. And then we end up with something like this. This is yet another schematic, another summary of how thinking works. And this is really a summary of what goes on inside your head, each and every one of us. It goes inside our heads all the time, when we're awake and when we are asleep. This is something that just keeps on working. Now, there's an interesting way to look at this, because over here on the right, this stuff is the business of science. This is thinking and distilling knowledge about the physical world. You can see we're detecting interactions up here, and we're forming experiences and thinking about them and building knowledge and acting on them and doing experiments. And this is really just what goes on as we learn about the world. On the left, we have all the foundational principles that the rules of thought, the things that make it possible for us to do our thinking and our processing. That's called analytic philosophy. That's what the philosophers do. So you can see that you need that sort of philosophy to feed into the process that goes on the right, to do all your thinking about the world. You can't think about the world if you don't think about how it is that you're thinking. So you have to learn to think before you can think about the world. And what you have to learn is this stuff. Laws of logic, ways of reasoning, and so on. And thinking about morals and ethics happens down along the bottom here. So that's what knowing systems do. This is what knowing systems are. Now, there's just one thing missing. Has anyone picked it? What's missing from this knowing system?
Instinct.
What's missing is this. Truth. It's a knowing system, but there's absolutely no mention of truth in any of all that. There's a good reason for that. Because there's no independent way of determining whether knowledge claims are factually correct, whether they're true or not. A knowing system may have factual experiences. It might experience something as it is, but it can't experience the sheer fact that it is a factual experience. It just has the experience. So it has no way of determining that something is factual other than by going around the loop and doing the justification and doing all the work. The only way to find out whether something is true or not is to justify it. There's no shortcut. So this is the tautology in Plato's justified true belief. Once it's justified, that's as true as it gets. You have no other way of finding out whether your justification is right or not. Justification is all you can do, and you can't tell if it's true or not. So that's knowledge. Okay? Let me go on to belief quickly. Well, what's belief? What's the difference between knowledge and belief? With apologies to the Skeptics Association. Okay, according to the English dictionary again, a belief is an acceptance that something exists or is true, especially one without evidence, without proof. In other words, belief is any proposition, any statement at all, a thought, an opinion, a view, whatever you like, that is accepted and upheld as true without regard for evidence. It is immune to evidence. It doesn't require evidence. It's just accepted as true. In the domain of beliefs, everything is true. That's what it means to believe it. To believe something is to think that it's true, right? So that's all it is. The only difference between knowing and believing is that beliefs are accepted as true without justification. It's the willing suspension of disbelief. There's no empirical verification. You're not interested. You believe it already. There's no critical analysis. You don't think about it. It's just taken on faith. There's no checking that the proposition makes sense. You just believe it. I mean, it's just brute, unquestioned acceptance. That's all it is. So what we have to do to modify our knowing system is we just have to turn off the justification bit. All we have to do is change it to unquestioned acceptance, and now we have a believing system. That's really all it is. There's no difference. Which is why we're all very good at believing things and knowing things. We're doing the same thing. We're just being a little bit less critical about the stuff we believe. All we do is turn off the justification stuff. Knowledge requires justification in exactly the way that belief does not. Now, of course, it's logically contradictory for something to be both justified and unjustified at the same time, which means that it's impossible in principle to both know and believe the same thing at the same time. If it's justified, then you know it, and if it's not justified, then you believe it. But you can't both know it and believe it at the same time. Okay? So that's something which is often held as a view, said, oh no, but of course I believe it, I know it. Well, no, you don't. If you know it, you don't believe it. I do not believe that 2 + 2 is 4. I dine out on that story. You can tell I don't have any friends. And the reason I don't believe is because I know that 2 + 2 is 4. I can sit down and prove it. I don't need to exercise faith. I don't need to believe anything about how 2 + 2 is 4. I know that it's 4. So I think we have to... Another problem for Plato, I think what we can do is tease those two things apart and separate beliefs and knowledge. Let's not talk about them in the same breath, because they're different in kind. Okay, belief doesn't even have to precede knowledge. Okay, it's possible to validate or prove a belief and then upgrade your belief to knowledge when the justification is in. Say, okay, well, I used to believe it, but now I found the evidence, I don't need to believe it anymore. Now I can know it. You can do that. But it's possible, for example, to discover or to learn and thereafter to know that the earth is round without ever having believed that it was. I don't think I ever went through life, and there's no stage in my childhood I can remember when I used to believe the earth was round. There was a time when I didn't know, then I learnt it, and then I knew. So I went from ignorance to knowledge. I didn't go from belief to knowledge. It's not exactly the same process. Knowledge and belief are related, but they are distinct cognitive states. Okay, like knowledge, there's also no such thing as a belief. There are just autonomous systems in states of believing that act as if they believed or act as if they knew. That's what a believing system does. So again, belief is likewise an attribution. It's something you're saying about them, or you might say it about yourself, but it's always an aboutness relationship. It's always something saying it about something else. It's not a property of the thing itself that it believes. Its state of believing is really just being in the state which disposes it to act in a particular way. So, if acceptance is a simple logical binary, then we either accept something or we don't. You can't half accept something. You can't half believe something. And belief is an acceptance. It's also a logical binary. So you either believe something or you don't believe something. You can't half believe anything. Belief doesn't come in degrees. There's no spectrum of belief. What there is instead is expectation. There are compounds or complexes of concepts, some parts of which you believe and some parts of which you know and some parts of which you don't. But there's no single part of a concept that you can partly believe. That's not possible. You don't do that. You either believe an item of data or you don't. So what that means is we should talk about expectations rather than a spectrum of belief. This is how I propose to do it. We seem to hold our beliefs with greater or lesser degrees of conviction, that's for sure. We all talk about how we believe some things more strongly than others. But we say that without thinking too hard about what we mean. People believe that there is a spectrum of belief as a result. But a spectrum of belief is inconsistent with this idea that you can't almost know Jack's phone number. And you can't half believe in the tooth fairy. You either believe it or you don't. There's no halfway. You can be ambivalent about it, but that's because there's some aspects of it that you know and some aspects of it that you don't know, and there's some aspects of it that you might or might not believe. But there's no single aspect that you can half believe. That's the bit you can't have. That's the bit you don't do. So ultimately, we either know or believe the elementary components, the elementary concepts that go into making up our compound beliefs, or we don't. So things must be 100% accepted to qualify as a belief, and they must be 100% justified to qualify as knowledge. Suspecting that something is true is not the same as believing it, and it's not the same as knowing it. It really is just suspecting it. Both our beliefs and our knowledge consist mostly of these compounds or complexes of ideas, any part of which, and only parts of which, we believe or have justified. So our beliefs and our knowledge claims are most often expressions of expectation, because we know a little bit about it, we believe something about it, and we somehow say, well, okay, in that case, I expect it to be like that, and you have a little leap of faith between what you know and what you're expecting, and the strength of that expectation depends on how much you know about it. It's a bit of a percentage game. So a more coherent way to characterize this, to characterize partially known facts and partially believed views, is as lying on a spectrum of expectation. It's not a spectrum of belief, it's a spectrum of confidence. Because there are some things about which are self-evident, some things we know, some things we believe, some things are utterly implausible, and the sum of all of that, all those little bits, you put them together, come up with a complicated idea, and then you either expect that to be true or not, based on a hunch that you build, based on percentages of how much about it you already know. Our confidence derives from our confidence in each of its constituent propositions, its elements, in how many of these we know or believe, and then we decide where it lies on our spectrum of expectation. And of course, as we justify more and more of the elements, so we update in a Bayesian kind of way our expectation that our thoughts and our ideas are correct or true. And if we reach 100%, then we claim to know it and say, aha, I've clinched it. I've now proved every little bit of thing that I need, and I don't need to have an expectation anymore. I now know it's going to happen. I now know it's true. So instead of Plato's representation of knowledge as justified true belief, which I really don't think works anymore, I'd like to propose a completely different model. I'd like to start with a body of facts. This is how the world is. These are worldly states of affairs. Regardless of whether we know them or not, they are just how the world is. And I'd like to have a set of statements, some of which are true and some which are false. The true ones correspond to the facts. They happen to be right. The false ones, where they're just statements like the moon is made of green cheese, and they're not right, but that's okay, still a valid statement. So there is this body of statements, some are true, some are false. True statements are what we call truths. Now they are true, again, regardless of whether we know it or not. They just happen to be true because they happen to correspond the way the facts really are, despite the fact that we don't know it. We're not in this game. We might be in the business of making up the statements, but there might be statements here that we've never thought of, we've never even made up. This is just a universal set of all possible statements, some of which have never even been uttered by humans. It's just a bunch of statements. And they overlap, and there are some true ones. Now we come along and we choose to believe some of those statements. We accept them as being correct. No particular reason. We don't need a reason. It's just a belief. We don't need any justification. And some of them happen to be true and some of them happen to be false. So we have this bunch of beliefs. Then we have a bunch of other propositions, which are other statements about which we don't form a belief. These are hypotheses. You don't have to believe a statement just because you utter it. You can have a statement that you don't form a belief about. So these are the ones that you really don't care about, or you might care about them, but you haven't made up your mind. These are known unknowns. These propositions are things you know you don't know. It's a statement you've said, there's life on other planets in the universe. I don't know that. But I know I don't know that. I know what it means, and it might be true and it might be false. So I'm going to have a bunch of these propositions about which I have no opinion. I don't have a belief opinion about it. I haven't formed a view. I just know it's a proposition. It's a question. And some of them may be true and some of them may be false. And then I build expectations. What I do is I take some of these propositions that I just don't know, And some of these beliefs, some of these propositions that I've actually accepted as I believe them, and a whole lot of other bits and pieces of whatever else I know, and I'll put them all together and build an expectation out of it. And then I'll say, oh, maybe there is life on other planets. I expect that we'll find some. I've got no idea, but I've got some reason to suppose, some elements of it. I know what life is. I know what sort of planet you need to have. I now know there's about at least 4,000 planets that we've found out there, so the odds are looking good. And so I have an expectation. It's not a belief. I don't believe there is life on other planets. That's far too strong. I have no justification for that. And I don't know it. I just expect it because I have a feeling about some of the things that go into it, and some of it's true and some of it I've got no idea. Now, you then start justifying. You start justifying these propositions, you start justifying your beliefs, and the more you justify, the stronger your expectations get. The higher your expectations grow, the more confident you are that your expectation is going to be met. And you keep doing this, and your expectations grow and grow. You get more and more confidence until one day, bingo, you've hit 100%, you've proven absolutely everything, and you've just discovered that this has to be true. It just must be the case. Now you claim to know it. That's what knowledge is. Knowledge is claiming that you know something because you now have enough experience and enough information to justify everything that goes into it. And then what you do, of course, is you have a little feedback loop down here, and you use that knowledge to justify further expectations, and then you build knowledge on top of knowledge. And that's how knowledge grows. So this is my model. This is how I think knowledge works. It's not the justified true belief. I think that's far too simplistic, and there's lots of cases where it doesn't work. I think this works in every case. So I think it's this process, and it's the result of this process, and it's that there. It's the state of being in that position where you know. Whatever it takes for you to know that, and whatever it takes for you to know it might be different for what it takes for me to know it. Whatever it takes, that's what knowing means. And I think that that applies to every case. Okay, so we're up to truth. What is truth? In this knowledge, belief, expectation model, the one that I drew of what I think a knowing system is like and how knowledge works, truth is not a kind of statement, it's a property of statements. A statement is a statement, and if its semantic content, if what it's about happens to coincide with the way reality is, then it's true. If it doesn't happen to coincide, then it's not. It's not a special kind of statement. It's just, you don't need to have a different kind of statement for it to be true. It just has to, the content has to be correct. So truth is the quality, this is a definition from a dictionary of philosophy I found. Truth is the quality predicated of a statement or a proposition whose meaning wholly corresponds to the relevant facts or worldly states of affairs. And this is known as the correspondence theory of truth. What makes a statement true is that its content corresponds to the facts, regardless of whether you know it or not. On this definition, remember, facts are not statements about facts. Facts are the way the world is, and you can have factual statements, which are true, but statements themselves are never facts. This is, again, a common misuse of words in the English language. We tend to talk about facts as being factual statements and also states of affairs in the world. I think we should distinguish between those two, and then it'll start to make a whole lot more sense. We don't want to mix those two up. On this definition, facts and truths are not the same. Facts are actual states of affairs in the world, and truths are statements that assert the facts, that state what the facts are. They are factual, but they are not themselves facts. So, truths are the statements that correspond to facts. Remember the overlap between statements and facts. Those that overlap happen to be true. But there are other definitions of truth too. I'll give you two more. The most common one of all, even more common than the correspondence theory, is this idea. The truth of a statement consists in the agreement or coherence of its meaning with some specified set of other statements and propositions, some reference set of statements. If what you say agrees, if the content or the meaning of this statement agrees with what all those other statements say, then that's what makes it true. Okay? This is the coherence theory of truth. But note that on this formulation, the statements in the reference set are true only in the same way, by cohering with yet other sets of statements, and so on in an infinite regress. Truth is not in any way connected to physical reality anymore. It's just connected to a whole bunch of statements which are self-referentially coherent. They could all be false, and they would still be perfectly coherent. Okay? In other words, according to the coherence theory, truth statements that cohere with other truths, and truths and facts are now the same. They are statements. There's actual worldly affairs, but true statements and facts, they're the same because they're just true and factual, just because they agree with other statements that are true and factual. And that's all there is. Then there's a pragmatic definition of truth. The truth of a statement or proposition consists in the assent or adherence to its meaning by its intended audience. This is the consensus theory of truth. Truth is whatever everybody agrees that it is. Okay? Now, ironically, of course, there was a charge of consensus truth by consensus among the general public against the IPCC's findings on climate change. So there was a consensus that the consensus was wrong. Go figure. The beauty of this stuff, of course, is that any correspondence between consensus truth and actual physical fact is purely coincidental. It has absolutely no bearing on facts whatsoever, and basically it's just whatever people feel. If everybody believes there is a tooth fairy, then suddenly it's mysteriously true in this culture that there is a tooth fairy. So truth is no longer related to fact. You can disconnect them entirely on this theory. I don't propose that we do that with our scientific research. Okay? On the correspondence interpretation, which is the one I prefer, I like my stuff to be factual. I like facts. I can rely on them to be right, even if I'm wrong. Truth and validity are unrelated properties, and statements are independently valid and true. Another confusion which happens a lot in philosophy as well as out in everyday language, people confuse validity and truth. So I want to draw a very sharp distinction between them. I think we should talk about them separately. Okay? A statement or proposition or claim is valid when its logical entailments are axiomatic and its derivation is formally correct. So in other words, if it coheres, if it's coherent, then it is valid. If it agrees with all the laws of logic, agrees with all the basic axioms and rules and ways of thinking about things, then it is logically valid and proven. That's okay. That's a valid statement. But notice that it doesn't have to correspond to facts. It just has to be valid. Truth is an additional claim that says, and even if you haven't got the proof for it, it may still be true. Truth is that what it means actually is how the world is. It corresponds to the fact. That's a whole separate issue. By contrast, on the coherence interpretation, validity and truth are the same. Because once something is valid, that's what it makes it true. It just coheres with everything, everybody agrees, so therefore it's true. So truth and validity are conflated in the coherence model, and I think that's a mistake. I don't like doing that. Beliefs, of course, can be about anything at all. You can believe anything. You can, if you wish, believe in the tooth fairy. You can believe the moon is made of green cheese. All bets are off. But knowledge pertains only to matters of physical fact, because they have to be true. They have to correspond to the facts. So there are lots of things about which you can have beliefs, which are not candidates for knowledge. You can only know those things that in fact claim something is about the world. If it makes no claim about the world, then there's no way of telling if it's true or false. There's no way you could say that was knowledge. It's just opinions, things, facts, or just ideas or notions you hold in your head. In the physical domain, the world of facts and science, the measure of knowledge is truth by correspondence. You want your science to correspond to the facts. In the conceptual domain, in the world of thoughts and ideas, the measure of belief is validity. It's validity by coherence and consensus. So it depends which domain you're talking about. If you're talking about the world of ideas and concepts, then you can have validity till the cows come home, and that's all you can have because there's no way of showing any of it's true because it's not making any claims about the physical world. If it makes a claim about the physical world, now you want correspondence, and then you can show that it's true. So truth and validity operate in completely separate domains, and they're two completely separate ideas. It's an unfortunate accident of language and a source, I think, of considerable confusion, both in philosophy and elsewhere, that the term truth is used to mean both of these. I think it's a great shame. My proposed model of knowledge, belief, and expectation employs the correspondence theory of truth. In other words, if you want to know something, then you have to know something that is something about the world, and the justification is that you've demonstrated that the world is in fact like that. Now that means that your knowledge claims are truth claims. They're assertions that something is true when you claim to know something. You cannot assert that you know something and at the same time maintain that it's false. Now, these truth claims have to make an existence claim for their meaning. If I want to say apples are red, then I'm making a claim that apples exist in order to be red. There have to be apples, otherwise my statement might be valid in picture books, but I'm not saying anything about the world, and there's no truth content. I have to have a validity claim for my derivation of how I came to the conclusion that apples are red. I have to define what things are and show that my argument makes logical sense. And then I have to make a truth claim for the elementary principles on which that argument is based. But of course that's circular, and this is where there's a certain loop of, this is how you build up bodies of knowledge. Those axioms are themselves truth claims that also have to meet these criteria. And so on, all the way back down till you get down to elementary basic principles of logic. If truth claims are about actual states of affairs in the physical world, then of course we also have to define what we mean by the physical world, by what we mean by reality. And I propose two definitions. The first definition is by Benedict Spinoza. He said, reality is that which does not depend for its sheer existence on the existence of any other thing. Remember that if it did depend on those other things, then it would be those other things that would be the reality and not this one. It's not transitive, it's not heritable. Reality is just whatever is in its own right. It's what goes. The other definition by Philip Dick, he just says, reality is that which when you stop believing in it refuses to go away. I think it's lovely. It really sums it up nicely. Okay, so justification. Justification is also difficult to describe because it has different meanings as well. It's all these things. It's to explain, it's to prove, it's to make a case for, to demonstrate. And these are also related topics or related issues, but they're also not quite the same thing. The last of these, justification for accepting something, a reason for holding that something, believing something is true, is particularly revealing, I think, because at least in the case of beliefs, there are two levels of justification. You've got justification for the content of the belief, like I have reason to believe that Jack's phone number is 9368, whatever it is. But then I might also have another justification for holding the belief that Jack's phone number is 93. It's a sort of a meta-belief. Remember we spoke about those meta-beliefs. And knowledge does have that meta, or justification also has a meta-justification where you justify the fact that something is justified rather than justifying the finished product. For example, you may be justified in believing something you read in a textbook. Why? Well, it wouldn't lie to you. Of course it's true. But then you may not be justified in upholding that what you read is true because you didn't understand the content. You haven't got the justification for why it's like that. I've read quantum mechanics textbooks which say certain quantum phenomena hold, and sure, I believe them. Yeah, okay, I'm justified. I read in a textbook. Anyone asks me, why do I hold that view? It's in the book. But am I justified in holding that view? Not for a minute. I don't understand it, neither does anybody else. Okay, so When qualities of justification in context, they're context dependent. In the physical domain, what is justification is empirical evidence. Because it's a truth claim about the way the world is, the justification must come from the world, and it's empirical evidence which stands as justification for knowledge in the physical domain. In the epistemic domain, in the world of concepts and ideas, it's logical proof. Has nothing to do with the real physical world. Now it's just a concept. And if in mathematics, for example, if you've got a logical proof, then you've justified in holding the view that 2 + 2 is 4. Which is valid, by the way, but it isn't true. It is not true that 2 + 2 is 4. Not only do I not believe it, it isn't even true. It's perfectly valid. There's a logical proof for it, but it doesn't say anything about the world, and there's no empirical evidence for it. There is empirical evidence for the fact that you pick up 2 apples, and then you go and pick up another 2 apples, and you do certain things in the world, and you suddenly end up with a basket with 4 apples in it. That's true. That is a truth claim. But the abstract concept that 2 + 2 is 4, I'm not going to go out in the garden and come back with a bucket of numbers in it, and I can't show you that 2 + 2 is 4. Sorry? Use your fingers. Then I've got a bucket with 4 fingers in it. But yeah, of course you can do it. But that's not empirical evidence. That just means that you know what the number 2 means and what the number 4 means. It's valid. It's logically perfectly valid, but in actual fact there's no truth correspondence. There's no truth claim. So if you separate knowledge and validity, I think this starts to make a whole lot more sense. We often don't, and very few of us have any experience at all in doing this, and it's really hard to do. In the abstract domain, of course, it's just formal argument. It's Aristotelian logic. Whenever justification is called for, then, it's necessary, first of all, to specify what kind of justification you are seeking. Otherwise, you'll have a debate with someone about whether they know something, and they'll give you their justification, and you'll say, no, that's not justification. That's not what I want. It doesn't justify it for me. So you have to agree on what kind of justification is acceptable and what kind of evidence is admissible. And it's not going to be the same in every case. It really depends what you're talking about. Some justifications provide causal explanations for how things work and how things have to be, while others provide only reasons for why it's reasonable to believe something. That's a whole different type of justification. In fact, justification is up to 4 different types of inputs. There's foundational principles and axioms. I'll give you examples of these. There's truth-functional, formal, symbolic logic. There's incontrovertible brute facts in the world. And then there are empirical observations. And all of these play a justificatory role. It is from these 4 ingredients that we construct coherent and consistent justificatory arguments from which we test, verify, corroborate, and falsify our various hypotheses and our expectations. And from which we distill truth and knowledge. If we manage to get it all right and build up 100% confidence, then we can claim to know something. Foundational principles and axioms define the physical and epistemic domains. They define presence, absence, sameness, different, change, event, entity, space, time. All these concepts that you need are foundational principles out of which, or in terms of which, you do all your thinking. And these are just things you have to accept as definitions, if you like. That you can't separately prove those, because all the things that you derive from them assume them. So you can't then use the derivations to prove their own axioms. That's circular. You can't do that. These are just definitions, if you like, that you have to have in order to build the justification. You start with those. Then, of course, you have the language of logic. You've got symbolic representation, how to formulate arguments, all the Aristotelian syllogisms and so on, and that comes into play. You need those tools for thinking logically. There are incontrovertible brute facts. They're the ways the physical world simply must be for there to be anything thinkable or knowable at all. It's an absolute brute fact that the universe is heterogeneous, for example. It's not homogeneous custard. It cannot be, because otherwise you wouldn't be here to think about it. So there are some things about the world that are just brute facts. They're empirically observed. You can verify them. You can't explain why they're like that, because it has to be like that in order for you to explain them. Again, they're axiomatic to your arguments. But still, they are brute facts about the world. There just happens to be something rather than nothing. That's a brute fact. and no one knows why, but sure as hell has to be the case. And then there are empirical observations from which we make inferences and draw conclusions and derive knowledge, such as the speed of light's a constant. Well, that's an empirical fact. We just observe that it is. No one really quite knows why. Okay, so formal or symbolic logic. I won't go too much into the logic of it all, but these are all the things that go into logic. It's a way of thinking about things rather than of them. It's a universe of symbolic representation. It's syntax and grammar. It's rules for making valid deductive arguments. And it's all the different machinations of how you go about thinking. Axioms, of course, are fundamental. We just accept them as true no matter what, by definition. The laws of logic are amongst those. Principles of negation, rules of syntax, rules of predication, how you describe things as being like other things, and so on. Axioms like these, in fact, form the basis of all reasoning. You cannot think without having these axioms at the bottom of what you're doing. Even if you don't know they're there, you're using them. So justifications are justificatory, of course, only to the extent that they're understood. You cannot have a justification you don't understand. How would that justify anything? And of course, understanding depends on constitutive, mereological, and causal explanations. Mereological is a word you may not be familiar with. It's how big things are made out of little things. Okay, it's how little things are put together to make big things. It's constructivist in that way. So you can have constitution, you can have construction, and you have causal explanations for how things are. And these things are explanatory, and if you understand them, then you can use them as justification. Unexplained knowledge claims are not justified. You cannot be justified in making a claim about something if you don't understand the explanation for why it has to be so. That's not a justification now, it's just a belief. You can believe it, sure, but you can't explain it, you don't understand it, it's not justified. You're not justified to claim that you know it. You can claim that you remember it, but you can't claim to know it. On pain of circularity, of course, justifications can't justify their own assumptions. That's again a circularity we won't admit. As the Scottish philosopher David Hume observed, generalizations are never 100% justified. Empirical observations are always underdetermined. Remember the story about how all swans were white? Well, until Mr. Willem Hessel's De Vlaming visited Australia in 1697, and then nobody said that all swans were white anymore. They changed their mind. So, we are limited to drawing only tentative conclusions about the world. Whenever we make a generalization, we can never be justified in a universalization, in a generalization like that. All we can say is, as far as we know. Now, I tried that. I tried being intellectually honest with all my friends, and I prefaced every sentence I said to them with, as far as I... That conversation didn't last long. I told you I don't have any friends. Okay, a knowledge claim, in fact, must be doubly justified. First of all, the content must be justified, and then the act of justification must itself be justified. Justifications, here's another trick too. Justifications must also be current. Things have to be justifiable now. Because if some previously justified knowledge claim ceases to be justifiable today, then you can't justify if it's true anymore. The attendant knowledge ceases to be known and ceases to be knowable. How do you know that what you read in a history book actually happened as it is written? It could be a work of fiction for all you know. Knowledge claims of historical events may be believed. I believe that there was a war in 1066 when Norman did his Normaning. I can expect it to be true because I have some level of experience or confidence or faith in the content of history books. But strictly speaking, if I can't justify it, I can't know it. It's just believable. It's credible, but it's not justified. Here's the example. Now, was it William II who conquered England in 1066? Or was it his uncle Egbert in 1065? Would anyone like to have the argument? How would you know? What evidence could you bring to bear upon your argument to prove your case? You don't know. You believe that it was William II in 1066. And I agree with you. I believe it too. But it's not knowledge. It's a belief. Be very careful about what you claim to know, because many of these things are expectations, and you don't really know them because you don't have the justification for it, and you can't produce the justification for it. Of course, just as absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, we're all familiar with the saying, even though we get it wrong all the time, so the absence of justification is not justification of any contrary claim. Just because you can't justify one argument, it doesn't mean the opposite argument's right. It just means you haven't justified your argument. That's all it means. The unjustifiability of the claim that there is no God, for example, which is something atheists would claim, it doesn't justify the claim that there is one. It just means you're not able to justify your claim that there isn't. That's all it means. It doesn't even raise the probability. It does nothing for the other argument. So, let me summarize. Let me try and wind this up, because I'm sure you've heard my voice for far too long. What have I done? I've showed you how knowing systems work. This is what you do all the time. You're going around that circle approximately 40 times every second of your life. This is what your brain does, whether you know it or not. I've shown that if you change this to unquestioned acceptance, you suddenly have believing rather than knowing. All you have to do is be a little bit less critical about your justifications, and you now have beliefs wholesale. I've showed you what thinking is. I've shown you what goes on down here and how you process information to build up justificatory stories. And I've showed you how thinking and knowledge are accumulated, how they rely on philosophical concepts, how you act on them, and how you go through life as if you knew something. It really isn't as if. You don't actually have to know anything. You just have to behave in a manner which is representative of what you do. Like I said, you can ask someone, you can ask a truck driver, how do you reverse park a B double? And he won't be able to tell you. He doesn't know. He just does. We're all like that. I was having a chat to Peter earlier. What's the capital of Peru? Well, you have to go around that cycle, think about it for about half a second, then you say, Lima. But you had to work it out. Did you know it before you worked it out? Did you know it before you went looking in memory or put some process in place to try and work out what the answer was? The answer is no, you didn't. You never know anything until you go through the process and you produce it out of memory and you work it out. And you come up with a justifiable argument for it, and then you say, yes, I know, it's Lima. Okay, so that's how we do it. It's a process, it's not even a state. What else have I done? I've shown you the relationship between knowledge, beliefs, and expectations. This is, I think, how it works. This is really what's going on. It's nothing like Plato's justified true belief, and I hope it's a better model, because I use this model. This model works for me. We can talk about it in Q&A. You can tell me what you think of it and point out all the mistakes. So, knowledge, of course, can be understood at various levels. At a minimum, it's an interpretation which is just mere awareness or mere remembering. I remember Jack's phone number, so therefore I know it. It's as simple as that, no thinking required. At the other end, a maximum interpretation is full justification via complete explanation from first principles. That's a big ask. We often don't have that. In fact, I think we almost never have that. But if you want knowledge to be that, well then that's what you're claiming. Different kinds of knowledge, of course, call for different kinds of justification. I've shown you how in the physical domain it's correspondence and truth, and in the metaphysical or abstract domain it's coherence and validity. And in all cases, of course, for all of these cases, knowledge is just whatever it takes. It doesn't even have to be the same thing in every case or the same in everybody's head. It can be individual. It's perfectly subjective. All you have to do is be able to do the things that you're being accused of knowing, and then you're going to have the knowledge. And even you yourself are going to think you have the knowledge, basically because you're able to deliver the goods. That's that's the justification for it. So all you need is whatever it takes to perform actions correctly, consistently, and reliably, and then you say, knowledge is that's what it is. Knowledge is in fact just this. It's no more than this and it's no less than this. That's all knowledge is. Just an attribution of an ability of being able to perform or produce the goods. Let me end with some acknowledgements. This is my research team. If you don't recognise the faces, there are the names. Let me also do some blatant self-promotion. If you'd like to know more about this, there's my Facebook page and my web page. By all means, look me up, send me a note, ask me questions. Happy to engage. And finally, let me thank you all for being a wonderful audience. Thank you very much.
Well, I think you'll all agree that it was a wonderful presentation, and we really thank you, Tibor, very, very much for coming tonight. Look, we don't have a lot of time for questions. We've probably got about 3 or 4 questions, so we might start with Anthony, and then we'll come with you.
Tibor, thank you very much. That was very difficult to cover, and you've done it well. Just in your schematic on belief and knowledge, where you had the justification switched on and off, are we talking 2 separate schema, or is there this internal switch we have that we can flick on and off? I'm not quite sure.
I think it's just a switch.
It's a switch. Okay.
I think if we just disregard the justification, then we're in a state of believing. And if we decide that, no, we're not happy with that, we need it to be justified, then we're seeking knowledge. And if we manage to come up with it, then we know it. But really it's just whether we turn on or off that particular part of our requirements for what we need to justify our beliefs.
Can you just have
a fashionable thought? We hear now every day post-truth. What is bloody post-truth and alternative facts that Trump is bellowing out, and people, even in the academic world, are following to use that kind of lingo?
That's a very good question. These are political statements and not philosophical ones or scientific ones. Post-truth is not truth. Fake facts are not facts. It's just when you're lying and you don't want people to... It's when you don't want to admit that you're lying, but you're really not telling the truth. It's like being very liberal with the truth and the facts. I think that's all it is. There's no more to be said about it. There are no... it's like saying that there are such things as a false apple. Well, it's either an apple or it's not. It could be a plastic apple or a ceramic apple or something, but it can be a fake apple, in which case it's not an apple. But there's no such thing as something which is an apple and is falsely so. It just doesn't make any sense. So this is just political nonsense, and I wouldn't pay any attention to it whatsoever. Treat it with the disrespect that it deserves.
Thanks very much, Tibor. My question is about knowledge and how it's attributed to action. So you mentioned that to know, you have to have some action or to deliver the goods, in other words. Why is it necessary that it's required to deliver the goods, or that there needs to be an action? So can we just know something without having to deliver any goods? That's kind of...
Okay, that's a good question. Well, sometimes delivering the goods is just being able to think about what you know. Even that's doing something. But if you don't do anything, how would you ever know that you know anything? It has to be action-based. And in fact, what we do most often is, I think, we retrofit the knowledge claim. How many times has happened to you where you did something and say, oh, I didn't know I could do that? Because you realize that you knew only after you actually did it. You didn't even know that you knew. So I think it is action-based, it's event-based, it's performance-based. And then what we do is we disembody the whatever it takes for us to be able to do that, and we call that knowledge. But without actually exercising it, without thinking about it or mentally doing or physically or something, doing something, you'd never know that you knew anything. So I think it's all action-based. And all justification for actions and for knowledge are, in fact, the actions that are produced and which are claimed to be knowledgeable acts. I think that has to go. I don't know how you do it the other way around. I'm happy for suggestions.
Just 2 more questions, and we really need to wrap up, Pam.
What would you say is the role of intuition on this spectrum?
Intuition is a little bit like imagination or opinion. It's thoughts that you create spontaneously from your adaptive memory, and they become inputs into thinking as opposed to outputs of thinking. You don't have to think about what your intuitions are. You have those intuitions and then think about them. So intuitions are just raw data. They're ideas.
Tibor, thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. We really enjoyed it. Thank you.